being here. My name is Linda Haley. I'm the director of the Reiki Center here in Columbus. And the topic for today is spirit attachments and how to release them. But what I'm going to talk about is a more interactive approach to releasement. And many people have had the experience of working with a releasement, either for yourself or someone you care about. But I will tell you, not that many people know about this topic. So this is going to be something that for some people may be a bit of an eye-opener. Let me tell you what I know about it, and I'll tell it from my perspective, which may be a little bit different from what you've heard about with other people. The very first time that I ever knew about this entire topic of releasements, I was working with one of my students. I'm a Reiki teacher, and the student had just gone through the attunements to become a level 1 practitioner, and about 2 or 3 days after her first class, she called me up and said, I don't understand, why is it that when I work on myself, I keep saying no? And I said, what do you mean? She says, I keep shaking my head back and forth and saying no, 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 no. I have no idea. I said, well, why don't you come in and we can talk about it? She came in, she got on my table, and almost immediately I put my hands on her, and almost immediately her head went back and forth, and she kept saying no, 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 no. But what was interesting was her voice was different. I knew as a 55, 58-year-old woman, very quiet, very shy, very an extraordinarily gentle person. And her voice suddenly changed, and it was almost though a child was talking to her. No, 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 no. So finally I said, why are you saying no? And she said, I don't want to go. And I said, why would you have to go? She says, well, because I was supposed to go and I didn't go, and now I'm scared and I just don't want to go. And I said, well, who's making you go? Well, everybody else left, and I was supposed to go with them, and I didn't. And I hid, and I don't want to go because I'm scared. Well, I started realizing it was not my friend talking. And I thought, okay, at this point I'm kind of feeling a little like Brian Weiss must have felt when he first realized the concept of hypnotherapy can take you into another life. And I thought, okay, I'm breaking all new ground because I had never even heard of what was going on. So I started talking to her, and I said, well, who are you? And it was a little girl. And this little girl was supposed to go to the light. She passed away. She was only about 4 years old. She was supposed to go to the light and didn't. And I said, well, why didn't you go? Well, because I was afraid and I didn't want to, and so I just thought, I'm just not going to go. We ended up talking for probably 15 or 20 minutes. And what was interesting, her words were coming through the client. And the client periodically would open her eyes and look at me like, I don't know what's going on. I said, it's okay, you'll be okay. And eventually, the client just started talking as though she were this little 4-year-old girl. So I said, honey, you really are not supposed to be here. This isn't your home. You need to move to where you're going to be safe, where you'll be welcomed, where you'll be loved. And as much as I know that you feel like you need to be here, this is not where you're supposed to be. And so we dialogued for a little bit, and I said, honey, who do you need to see? Who do you want to see? And I miss my mommy. So with absolutely no knowledge whatsoever what to do, I called on her guides, I called on my guides, I called on all the highest helpers I could think of. The woman on the table says, she takes this huge intake of breath and gasps and says, I see this light, it's coming down. It's completely surrounding this little girl who she is seeing at this point. And then she says, oh my gosh, I see a woman coming down from the light. And she relays this entire scene. I know, chills. Mm-hmm. It was amazing to go through this. So she relates this entire scene of how this little girl runs to the mother, and together they go into the light. Well, after a couple minutes, I try to compose myself because this is taking me way out of my comfort zone, completely out of my comfort zone. I had never even heard of what was going on. She gradually comes back to awareness after her Reiki treatment, and she's like, what happened? I said, I'm not really sure. But what was really interesting is what happened after that. What happened after that was that her personality radically shifted. She no longer was timid. She no longer was fearful. She no longer had the personality, the filter, the overlay of a frightened 4-year-old child. She blossomed. She became strong. She became confident. Her own personality was shining through. No longer was she seeing the world through the eyes of a very frightened child. Well, at that point, I started taking a little bit of time to try to figure out what was going on. And I only saw, every so often, maybe once every 3 or 4 months, I would see one that was very similar. And I started to realize that when someone started to shift energy, whether you were an energy practitioner, whether you were coming into a heightened sense of awareness, of enlightenment, you started to shift energetically to a completely different plane. And when you got to that plane, something that was a lower energy was not able to survive. So I started to see at some point people I knew who were starting to move into a happier place, they started to have attachments. That's what I knew that they were, eventually I knew that they were called. And so I realized that the attachments are a lower, slower vibration. And as attachments are unable to move to a higher vibration, that's where they will become known. So I want to talk just a little bit about what is an attachment and what do you need to know about them. How are you able to identify an attachment? What are some of the manifestations, whether it's behavior, physical characteristics, and then what do you do to protect yourself? I will tell you these are very common. I mentioned that when I first started doing this work, I discovered that maybe once every 3, 4, 5 months I would have something that would be very similar. Now I'm probably releasing 3, 4, 5 a week. It's very, very common. So what is an attachment? I think everyone assumes that there is something that you call a soul. It's your personality, it's your spark. It's whatever your inner vision, your higher self, says, this is me. And when we pass on to the light, whatever you perceive that to be, whether you call it heaven or the other world or whatever, but whenever you pass on from physical into spiritual self, you have the personality move into that central location. But what happens if it doesn't? Well, there are a lot of times that it doesn't. And if it does not, and it ends up in a physical location, and the personality, the spirit, wants to stay in that physical location, sometimes we call it a ghost. And it continually just repeats something that is familiar. It could be a pattern of activity. It could be a behavior. It could be some kind of a physical manifestation. But that's very common. That's probably a little better known. But what if this personality does not want to stay in one location, but wants to know what it feels like to still be in a body? And during those times, that's when the soul will then move into another body, which we can call the host or another body. So why is it that sometimes you don't go to the light? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, it could be that you're afraid. If you're a little child and from the time that you were aware, you were told you're a bad little child and God is going to punish you, and you have the opportunity to go to the light, your response is going to be, don't want to, just don't even want to think about that. But what if you've been part of an abusive relationship and you know that on the other side you may see that person again? That's very common. What if you have compulsive behavior? What if you have addictions? What if you really like the physicality of life? What if you're a partier? What if you do not want to give up the pleasures of the material world? Then you're not going to want to go. What if it turns out that you have unfinished business? What if perhaps you passed away through some kind of a wrongful act? What if you feel like you want to, complete a process, whether it's looking out for someone, whether it's passing information on, your mother perhaps doesn't want to leave children. What if there is a reason for why you absolutely do not want to go on to the light? What if it turns out that you don't believe that you're worthy? What if you've been raised to believe that you are unkind, that you are a negative person, an evil person? What if you believe that you are not good enough to go to the light? There are all the reasons that, in addition to possibly you're a very low energy person, maybe you're somebody who has always been an angry person. People who live at a very low vibration are probably not going to want to easily move into the light. You've been very comfortable living at a low vibration. You may exhibit signs of mental illness. You may be confused. You may have died through trauma and you don't realize that you are dead. There are any number of reasons for why you may feel that you're either not worthy or you don't want to move to the light. So the people who do move into other host bodies are traditionally people who are either very confused, feeling very lost, unsure of themselves, or they're people who are very low vibrations. So keep that in mind as we go through the process of identifying the characteristics of someone who does move into a host. If you think about people who talk about hearing voices, if you think about people who have a fairly dramatic personality change, someone perhaps may be a very optimistic, enthusiastic person one day, and the next day hostile, depressed, suicidal. Think about people who periodically just say, I'm just absolutely exhausted. There's no physiological reason, there's no physical reason for why I should be so tired, but I just feel absolutely drained. You might find that people may very oddly speak about themselves in the third person. I know that my husband, coming back from a business trip, texted me and said he will be home at 9 o'clock. I thought, he will be home at 9 o'clock. He had something that we had to release. You might quite often find that they'll refer to you as it or we. We don't want to do that. We are not going to participate. People who have this sense of brain fog or confusion, think about the possibilities and just consider, and I'm not saying always, but just consider the possibility that if someone is hearing voices, perhaps they truly are. If you are an energy worker, there are some things to look for. If you're used to putting your hands on someone, whether it's Reiki, craniosacral, or any of the other body works, body talk, whatever, if you're used to putting your hands on someone and you can feel a blockage, we believe that energy goes through the body in pathways called meridians, and occasionally those energy pathways become blocked, whether through trauma, whether through disease, whether through the negativity of emotions that is blocking you from feeling like you are really an enlightened, aware, optimal health kind of person. But if you are perhaps feeling, when you put your hands on someone, the blockage moves, that's not a blockage. If you talk to someone and you talk about the whole issue of spirit attachments, and you see a change in that person. That person perhaps starts to have a panicked look in his or her eyes. I know in our classes, I've started to look for it, and especially people who are relatively new to energy work. After the first or second attunement, in traditional Reiki, you have 4 attunements for level 1 and 4 for level 2. So usually I'll see that there's usually one person in the class who manifests some kind of shift. As I talk about spirit attachments, you'll see something kind of odd happen. Either someone will start to get this panicked look in their eyes, and they start to hyperventilate. I've even had people look at me, terrified, tears coming down. I've had people in classes who said that this isn't real. This is not real, and I'm not going to listen to this stuff anymore. I had one woman who really wanted to take the Reiki classes, and the first class, she had a great time. Came back for level 2, and in the level 2 class, she's, no, we don't think this is making sense at all, no. And she packed up her things, and she left. She just left. And I could tell exactly what was going on because she immediately reacted with panic. I called her, she was on the road back up to Cleveland, and I said, what's going on? She says, I have absolutely no idea. All of a sudden, I just got this panicked feeling, and it's like, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. I talked to her later, and I said, I think what's going on is you have a spirit attachment. And she said, yes, I do, and I'm very comfortable with it. We've been together for a long time, and I really don't want to get rid of him. I got an email the next morning that came out, we are doing okay. We do not want to change. She was not the one who said, we are leaving. She is not the one who wrote the email to me and said, no, we are very happy. We've been together for a very long time, and we really don't want to change. If you find that perhaps you have physical ailments that just do not make sense, just consider the possibility. And again, I understand that for many people this is probably going to go way beyond comfort zones, but just consider the possibility that maybe what you've done is attract something. And that entity is sharing his or her physical issues. I had one person who had a tremendous amount of pain on the left side of her body. And it was a relatively new occurrence. And I knew this person very well. And so she came in for a treatment. We immediately identified that there was something else going on. We were able to dialogue with the entity, with the soul. And eventually we realized that this was an older man who had polio. And he was manifesting most of his physical ailments on the left side of his body. He was placing an overlay of his ailments. He was allowing his ailments to create a filter for the client. It was a very dramatic change. And as soon as the soul does depart, immediately the client goes back to all of his or her behavior patterns, personality. But it is one way of trying to identify if there is something going on that perhaps defies medical understanding. Most of the people who go to physicians have, if they talk about something like this, I just don't understand, I don't feel right, it doesn't feel like they're my thoughts, I don't feel like that it's all me in there, they're going to prescribe medication. The Eastern way of looking at the world, the non-traditional way of looking at the world, is if you understand the concept of a soul. A soul is not created or destroyed. a soul will move to wherever it needs to go to feel like it is the next stop on evolution. So if you understand it from that perspective, you'd have a better understanding of the whole concept of earthbound spirits. The whole concept of how those spirits can actually have an impact on a living human person. If you find that someone perhaps has a fairly significant change in food preferences, I'll give you some examples from my own life, because I have had quite a few attachments released. I believe that this is very, very common. I truly believe that everyone has attachments, but they do not act out unless your vibration gets to a certain level. And then at that point, that's when you really start to notice that there's something going on. For me, I had two that were fairly dramatic. One, I just married my husband, and it's about 20 years ago. And about 2 or 3 days after I married him, I thought, is that what he looks like? And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. A week later, I knew I was married to him. I did not recognize him. I had no idea who he was. I had to carry a photograph around so that I could even find him. We went to a museum, and I remember going to a ladies' room, coming back. I had to stand in the middle of the lobby and wait for him to find me. He was right over there. I had no idea who he was. I would wake up in the morning and look over him and scream, because I thought, oh my gosh, who is that? And it's like, oh no, I remember, okay, I'm supposed to be married, this is the person I'm supposed to be married to. It was a conscious decision just to remember that I was married to this person. I had no idea who he was. I started out with my personal physician, who sent me to a psychiatrist, who sent me to a clinical social worker for counseling, who recommended that I get a brain scan. And eventually, I went to an energy worker. I went to a Reiki practitioner. I had tried everything at that point. Every single result was perfect. It was a year and a half. The first year and a half that I was married, I had no idea who my husband was. At a Reiki practitioner's table, something left. She felt, I felt, and in that split second, I was back to myself again. I had had something in me that didn't want to share. It had been very comfortable in my life. I'd been single for a while, and this was somebody's like, no, it's just us. It was very competitive. I also had an opportunity to release another one. I didn't know that I even had this one, because I thought everybody bought a bag of pretzels, dumped out all the pretzels, and ate the salt on the bottom. I assumed everybody did that. Until I released one, and I realized, oh my gosh, you're supposed to eat the pretzels. I worked with someone who built an entire kitchen in her new house around a baking center. She loved to bake the pies and the cakes, loved it. Realized after release something, that wasn't her. She doesn't like sweets at all. This is very, very common. We will see a lot of children. A lot of children will be released. And when you release, let me give you just briefly a little bit about the process. Now, there are quite a few people who talk about just bring in the archangels, bring in the angels, and send them to the light. And that's a very effective technique, but sometimes you do not have the opportunity to really do that. If somebody is on your table and is talking to you in a way that absolutely makes no sense whatsoever, and you dialogue, and you say, well, why are you saying that? And the client will give back something that just plain does not make sense to you. Just consider the possibility that you may be working with another presence, another soul that is inside this body. The technique that we use at the Reiki Center, what we do is we dialogue with the person who is releasing. And the first thing I want to do is find out, who are you? Keep in mind, these were people. This is not something to be afraid of. These are people that perhaps, when a grandmother passed on, and you are saying to the grandmother, don't leave me, don't leave me. You have to stay with me. Okay, think about all the ways that we do attract. You know, we send the message that I need you to be with me always. There is no way that soul is going to want to leave you, because you have placed those guidelines. You've placed those expectations. So what we do is we will talk very kindly, very compassionately, very lovingly to the individual who is earthbound. And we'll say, you know, you really can't be here. This is not your home. I know that you believe that this is where you want to be, but you are not in your body. You need to move to where you'll be welcomed, where you'll be loved, where you'll be supported. And sometimes they will immediately understand what you're talking about. Quite often they will not. At that point, they'll say, no, I don't want to go. No, well, why don't you want to go? I like it here. You know, I like it here. I can do all the things that I want to do. I can still be with people. I don't want to go there. You know, I'm afraid to go there. I don't want to go there. Sometimes it takes a little time, and sometimes it's only a couple minutes, but if you compassionately set up a dialogue, and eventually you can convince them that this really is not your home. Look around, this is not your body. You're not supposed to be here. You know, it's time for you to find family members, friends, those who are looking forward to welcoming you to the other side. We always call in a guide, a helper, because at this point, you really are working in the realm of the spiritual. And when you do that, you need to realize that you are not the one that are really providing the connection. It's working with all of the higher vibrations to allow that energy to flow from one person up into whatever you perceive heaven or the other world to be like. I also want to find out why. Why did you pick this person? And I will quite often say, so how long have you been here? Oh, we've been here a really long time. So, and sometimes they will say we, and it's like, and how many more are in there? So I will quite often talk to the entity, to the soul, and I'll say, so when did you come in? Well, she was really, really sad. And she said, I just want somebody to help me. And I was there, and I just could come in and I could help her. Well, why was she really sad? Well, she was really being bullied, and she wanted somebody to be really, you know, mean and stand up for her. Okay, well, is that what you do for her? Yeah, I'm the one that kind of stands up for her when she needs me to. Okay, well, she's a big person now. She's an adult. I know that maybe when she was a child that you really needed her to do that, but she doesn't need you to do that anymore. She needs to be able to make her own decisions. And I know that this is something that you feel like you provided support to her, but just consider that if you really care about her, you'll let her move on to be her own person. Then we call in some kind of support that provides a vehicle, provides a way for someone to move to the light. And it may be someone who is known to the soul. Quite often it is. You may say, who do you want to see? Do you want to see a mom or dad? No. Okay. Was there anybody that you really want to see? Once I had a little boy who said, I had a dog once. I said, would you like to see your dog again? And the client was the one that told me exactly what the dog looked like. In this case, I did not see the dog. I saw a shape, but I did not see the dog. The client was the one that told me in detail exactly what the dog looked like, to come down, to gather up, his previous owner. And before they leave, this is really important. You need to let them know how much you really appreciated what they did for someone. If this one was somebody who came in to protect, to feel like, you were the one that came in to look out for. I was like the big older brother looking out for somebody. We always say thank you. Thank you for doing that. You did a good job, and now it's time for you to find something that, you find like you can find rest. We also ask them to gather everything that they have. If there's anything energetic that perhaps that they have, placed, not just in the physical body, but throughout the entire biofield. The biofield is the energetic body that goes beyond the physical. It is the energy inside the body, outside the body. If you think about all of the pathways and all the receptive channels coming in and out of the body, we're like this giant electrical bubble. So if you think about the energy inside the body is identical to the energy outside the body, then you try to find a way to make sure that everything is collected, whether it is inside the body or out in the outer field. And then the last thing we do is we say, now you need to go find everybody else. Because quite often, if there is one manifestation of an attachment, there's usually more. That's very common. So at that point, you call in all of your guides and every single one of your helpers. And as much as possible, you ask them to provide as much support as possible in order to release into the light. And if you are an energy worker, make sure that you see going into the light. That's really important. Just because someone is releasing doesn't mean that someone is gone all the way. I will tell you, once I saw a woman on the table who was releasing. She could not have any children. And for some reason, she kept bringing an awful lot of little children as attachments into her life. And I saw her energetically, with the intuitive eyes, as one of the attachments was relieving, I saw her reach up and grab it and bring it back. So think in terms of, this is something that is a totally symbiotic relationship. Think in terms of, and I don't want to say this in any way, I don't mean this to be a negative, but like a host-parasite that is completely symbiotic relationship. And so anything that is part of the original soul, any of the food preferences, any of the behavior manifestations, any of the physical ailments will quite often be transferred into the person that you're working with. And it may be one of you. It could be that you may find that for some reason something just doesn't make sense. Just know that this is a very good possibility. So now you have worked with the energetic body. You've seen things released to the light. You have a pretty good feeling that your client is completely free, or at least of the things that are the most expressive at that moment. And afterwards, the person's going to want to talk. And they're going to be very confused for the most part. They're going to want to ask questions. And so if you understand that this is something that is very, very common, and if you do not show any kind of panic on your part, and you can treat the situation with calm confidence, then that would probably make the people that you're working with feel a little bit better about it yourself. So how is it that you could even get an attachment in your body? Well, there's a lot of ways. I was talking a few moments ago about the little boy who came in because he felt like he needed to be protected, or he needed to protect the little girl. So I talked to the woman afterwards, and I said, do you remember that he said that he came into your body when you were 5 years old? She says, yeah, I remember, and I remember that exact moment when it happened. He says, I was riding my tricycle in the driveway, and I just found out that my parents were getting a divorce, and I was really, really upset, and I was crying and crying and crying, and I'm thinking, I just want somebody to help me. And this little boy came up to me and said, well, I can help you. And he says, you know what, I know that's exactly what happened. I just allowed myself to open up. And for all that time, she never really felt like she needed to look out for herself, because there was always someone else to look out for her. You can also open yourself up through things like Ouija boards. If you think about the energy of a Ouija board, what you're doing is saying, I'm completely opening everything up. I like whatever would like to come in and take over my body in order to move the plaquette. Think about the energy of what you're doing. What you're doing energetically is saying, I'm allowing myself to be used by something else for that period of time. I'm very, very cautious about anything that will come in and take over my body. Think about the concept of automatic writing. Think about all of the ways that if you do connect with your spirit guides and helpers, are you discerning enough to know that what is actually coming through is a high vibration? It may not be. You could also be in the wrong time, the wrong place. Could be your energy is really low for whatever reason. Maybe you're really sad. Maybe you have given into an evening of partying. Maybe you're really angry. Maybe you're very sick. Maybe you've gone through a trauma, a car accident, or whatever. And actually, one of the things that most people don't think about, you've gone through surgery. And at this point, an anesthesiologist is basically living for you. It's allowing your breath to flow through the anesthesiologist, is in charge of your life. You are, for that period of time, effectively out of your body. I have seen attachments jump from one person to another over 10 feet. I've seen someone who I know had a problem and someone who did not have a problem. I saw the person without a problem immediately react as though possibly had been hit. It did jump. So, if you are working with a non-interactive approach, then you will probably just call in the highest helpers, whether it is archangels, whether it is spirit guides, whether it is higher self, and in that case you will not dialogue. You will just ask for help, and you will find that there are quite a few books on the market right now talking about how you just call in spirit guides, helpers, archangels. Doreen Virtue has quite a few things that she talks about asking the archangels to vacuum anything that is negative out of your body. Very effective, except for when it doesn't work. If you do want to look into the possibility of something that is a little more interactive, then you may want to look at just a very gentle, loving, compassionate way of releasing the spirit into the light. And if you do that, then you have an opportunity to find out, so what is it that you were doing for me for the last few years? And when this spirit does leave, and you suddenly are no longer angry, you suddenly no longer have these unexplained physical ailments. You no longer feel suicidal or depressed. You no longer eat the salt in the bottom of the pretzel bags. You'll start to find that maybe there is another way of looking at healthcare in a way that is totally non-traditional. This is not a Western way of understanding of how you work with the world.